Right, so after you've worked for some time, you need to plan for your retirement, and I'm talking about the pension scheme. Before we go into details, I know that you would want to know something about the Act. And Act 766, National Pensions Act 2008, provides for pension in the country through the introduction of a contributory three-tier pension scheme. The Act also established the National Pensions Regulatory Authority to oversee the administration and management of registered pension schemes and trustees of registered schemes, as well as re-establishment of Social Security and National Insurance Trust to provide for related matters. And we're looking at the new and improved three-tier concept of the reform, which is meant to provide an option for you as you retire after work. And this afternoon, we have in the studios here Ernest Amate to also throw more light on it. That is Ernest Amate Vonde, who is the Director for Regulations of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Nanekia.
Right.
It's a privilege. Yeah.
Okay, first of all, let's look at the state of the three-tier pension scheme.
All right. Now, as you rightly said earlier on, the National Pensions Act, that's Act 766, established a three-tier pensions provision structure for Ghana. Now, this entails three main schemes. The first tier being the National Social Security Scheme, that is SNIT, the SNIT scheme. Then the second tier is what we refer to as the Occupational Pension Scheme, which is a work-based scheme. Let me explain that further. It means, for instance, that staff of TV3, for instance, could have what we call TV3 Occupational Pension Scheme. Then the third tier comprises what we call Provident Fund schemes, personal pension schemes, and group personal pension schemes. Now, it's worthy to mention that the first two schemes, that is the National Social Security Scheme and the Occupational Pension schemes, are mandatory, they are compulsory. It is expected that wherever any employer-employee relationship is found, this will compulsorily be instituted. And indeed, with the implementation of the Act from 1st of January 2010, contributions are being deducted from the salaries of all employees here in Ghana and being paid to these two schemes. Expectedly, this should be invested and looked after in a manner that it will give you some appreciable amount of money by the time you are going on retirement. The third tier, as I've spoken about, is voluntary. What it means, therefore, is that if, for instance, TV3 management thinks that Nanekia and Co are working hard enough and wants to give them some additional income when they go on retirement, we could establish a TV3 Provident Fund scheme and then make some contributions on behalf of staff, and of course staff can also contribute. That money will be invested, and by the time you're going on retirement, then it becomes available to you. But that happens
is it the same as the employer-sponsored scheme?
Right. Now, the employer-sponsored scheme comes in two forms. The first one is the Tier 2 one, which is the employer-sponsored occupational pension scheme. That's mandatory. The law requires that 5% of an employee's contribution must be invested in that. Then again, you can have an employer-sponsored provident fund scheme, which is at the third tier level, which is again voluntary. But that is entirely at the discretion, of the employer. Maybe some negotiation between the employer and the employee. The interesting thing is that the employer and the employee have up to 16.5% of your salary being tax-free if you want to make a contribution into that kind of scheme. But it's worth mentioning also that there is what we call personal pension schemes. Again, I mean, that particularly is geared more towards those who work in the informal sector, who do not earn monthly incomes as we know it. They earn daily incomes, weekly incomes, and so on. The self-employed people, and can make contribution in that kind of scheme to also give them some retirement. Hopefully, those of us in the formal sector, we are also allowed to make a contribution into a personal pension scheme if you want additional income when you go on retirement. So that briefly explains the three-tier pension. So it means that with the three-tier, we have two mandatory and one which is voluntary.
Exactly. But how different is it from our internally arranged funds, like, for instance, the Providence Fund?
Right. As I said, the Provident Fund schemes is entirely voluntary. And of course, they also are work-based kind of schemes. The flexibility with that is that because it is voluntary, and also a much bigger kind of tax allowance is available for you to invest into those kind of products. They've been existing for quite some time, just that they are now formally recognized under a new legal structure in terms of the national pensions.
And why would it be so important for an employer to make sure that they get the scheme?
You know what?
For its workers?
I'm sure any decent employer should be happy that when your employees exit their active working life, the way people see them is a reflection of the kind of employer that you've worked with. Obviously, if you leave your employment and people find that you walk about hungry, tattered, looking so desperate and poor, it's a very poor reflection on that employer. But I can bet you, if you give your employee a very sound retirement income, yes, you'll still look very young, live long, live a very decent life, and that in itself
with
will
the
be a
explanation, I don't think there'll be any
rate.
sanctions if the employer doesn't go ahead to do this.
Oh, with the mandatory ones, for sure, there are a lot of
has
sanctions.
to be done.
Yes,
Okay.
you must compulsorily contribute to the social security scheme and also to the occupational pension scheme. Indeed, if you don't contribute to it, you could be liable for legal prosecution.
We
and
would
sanctions.
want to go more into this, but I'm sure we could do that another time. But
Right.
I hope that we've been able to expand or explain to each and everyone where he or she plays his or her part. Thank you so much for joining us. Ernest Amate Vonde, Director for Regulations of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority.